Imagine the last thing you ate today. Now forget it. Forget everything you know about food. Forget flavor. Forget choice. Forget fullness. Now imagine you haven't eaten since yesterday. The day before that, you had half a bowl of gray slop that smelled like wet dirt. Your hands are cracked from the cold. Your children are thinner than they were last month. And outside, the rain hasn't stopped in 3 weeks. That is not a scene from a film. That was Tuesday. For most people alive in medieval Europe, that was just Tuesday. The year is 1100 EAD. Roughly 90% of Europe's population are peasants. They do not own the land they work. They do not choose what they grow. They owe a portion of every harvest to a lord they may have never spoken to, who lives behind stone walls and eats from silver plates while they go home to a single-room hut shared with their animals, not for company, but for warmth. And what do they eat? Pottage. Every single day, pottage. A thick, gray, often colorless stew boiled in an iron pot that sat permanently over the fire. Cabbage, leeks, dried peas, turnips, whatever the garden gave up. No seasoning most of the time. No fat unless they were lucky. The pot was rarely emptied. Families just kept adding water, kept adding scraps, kept boiling. The same pot, day after day, week after week. Some historians believe certain pottage pots were never fully cleaned. You were eating stew that was, in a very real sense, ancient. And bread. Always bread. Dense, dark, gritty rye bread that slowly ground down your teeth with every loaf. Archaeologists can identify a medieval peasant's skeleton without any other context. They just look at the teeth. When grain ran short, and it ran short every winter, bakers stretched it, ground dried peas into the flour, added chalk, added sawdust. There are court records from medieval England of bakers prosecuted for adulterating bread with sand and ash. People bought it anyway. People ate it anyway, because the alternative was their children crying themselves to sleep. Now here is the part that splits the medieval world completely in two. In 1393, a wealthy Parisian merchant wrote a book for his young wife on how to run a proper household. It is called Le Ménagier de Paris, the Goodman of Paris. Inside are recipes for roasted meats glazed with verjuice and ginger, for delicate fish soups thickened with almond milk, for sugar-dusted pastries filled with dried fruit and spice. That same year, a few miles outside Paris, a peasant family was rationing the last of their salted pork, praying the turnips in the ground would last until spring. Same country, same century, different planets. For the nobility, food was theater. A feast at a lord's table wasn't just dinner. It was a declaration of power. Whole roasted swans were served back inside their own skin and feathers, neck reattached, beak gilded with gold paint, arranged on the table as if still alive. Peacocks were roasted and redressed in their own plumage. A sugar sculpture of a castle, called a subtlety, might sit at the center of the table purely for display. You weren't supposed to eat it. You were supposed to understand what it meant. Sugar was so expensive in medieval Europe, it was classified as a spice, kept locked in a box, used in savory dishes the way a jewel is set into a ring, not because it improved the flavor, but because everyone at the table could see it was there. Pepper was worth its weight in silver. Cinnamon came from the other side of the known world. A lord might keep a small amount of cloves in a sealed pouch and hold it during a feast, just to smell it. Not to eat, just to smell. The spice trade didn't just build trade routes, it built empires. Wars were fought over the right to sell black pepper. People died for the privilege of seasoning food. And meanwhile, the peasant outside had salt, if he was lucky. But even for the nobility, there was one force more powerful than wealth, the church. In medieval Europe, roughly a third of every year was designated as fasting days. Fridays, the full 40 days of Lent, the vigils before every major feast. On those days, meat was forbidden, dairy was forbidden, eggs were forbidden. Over 150 days a year of enforced dietary restriction, handed down not by doctors or nutritionists, but by Rome. And here is where it gets fascinating. Restriction bred obsession. Because when you tell hungry, Creative people, they cannot have something. They engineer around it. Medieval monks, locked inside monasteries on fast days with no meat and no dairy, invented almond milk, not as a wellness trend, as a survival hack. They built entire culinary traditions around fish, legumes, and plant-based fats just to keep cooking through the forbidden months. The most sophisticated food in the medieval world came out of the most restricted kitchens. There is a reason so many of Europe's great cheeses, beers, and preserved meats trace their origins back to monasteries. The monks had time, resources, and a powerful reason to get creative. Now, the part that is harder to talk about. Forget the fasting. Forget the restricted diets of men who had full cellars and warm beds. Talk about what happened when the food actually ran out. Between 1315 and 1322, it rained. Not occasionally, relentlessly. 7 consecutive years of failed harvests across almost all of Europe. Historians call it the Great Famine. The rivers flooded. The grain rotted in the fields. Pack animals were slaughtered for food, which meant less land could be plowed, which meant the next harvest failed too. Within 2 years, people were eating dogs, then cats, then rats. Then they boiled leather, belts, harnesses, old boots, soft enough to chew, and swallowed it. They stripped bark from trees and ground it into something resembling flour. There are chronicles written by monks during this period that historians still find difficult to read. Accounts of people collapsing in the street and no one stopping because no one had the strength. Accounts of things that happened at night that no one spoke about in daylight. In some regions, up to 15% of the entire population died. And this was not a once-in-a-millennium catastrophe. Famine came roughly every generation. Every single person alive in medieval Europe had either survived one or been born from people who had. It was not history to them. It was memory. It was the thing their parents warned them about and their grandparents never stopped talking about. Eat while it's there. Waste nothing. Store everything. There is one more thing. In 1348, a ship docked in Sicily carrying sailors who were either dead or dying with black swellings the size of apples under their arms. The Black Death had arrived in Europe. Within 4 years, it had killed between a third and half of the entire continent. And here is the strange, dark footnote that food historians don't often mention. In the years immediately after the plague, the survivors, the ones who were left, ate better than any peasant generation before them, because suddenly there was more land than people to farm it, more animals than mouths to feed them. Wages went up. Meat appeared on tables that had never seen it. For a brief, strange window in history, the poorest people in Europe ate almost well. It took a catastrophe that killed 25 million people to give a medieval peasant access to protein. If you could stand in a medieval peasant's hut on a February night in 1200 AD and look at what's on their table, gray pottage, a heel of dark bread, maybe a scrap of salt pork that has to last another 3 weeks, you would not call it food. You would call it barely enough, but that person would look at your kitchen and not have the words for it. Cold air that keeps meat fresh for weeks. Fruit from places that don't exist on any map they've ever seen. Bread that someone else baked, already sliced, sealed in a bag. They would think they had walked into a dream. For 700 years of medieval Europe, almost everyone who ever lived went to bed calculating. How much is left? How long will it last? What happens if the harvest fails again? You open the fridge at midnight, not because you're hungry, because somewhere, deep in the part of your brain that still thinks winter is coming, you're still calculating.